At 6 inches the morning, the Lloyd's of London War Risk Committee convened. Not at its normal weekly session, not on its standard review timetable. This was an emergency meeting. The kind Lloyd's activates only when a very specific threshold has been crossed, when threat intelligence, incident frequency, and actuarial exposure have combined in a way that no longer allows delay, and the committee's fiduciary responsibility to its underwriters requires immediate action instead of waiting for the usual cycle. That distinction matters, because emergency convenings of this kind are rare. In the last decade, it has happened 4 times, and 3 of those 4 times involved the Strait of Hormuz. This was the 4th. That is what makes this moment more than another shipping disruption, more than another insurance adjustment, more than another warning signal buried in the fine print of global trade. It is a sign that one of the world's most sensitive risk systems has moved into crisis mode. The committee met at 6:00 inches the morning, and by 8 it had made the decision that every maritime insurer in London, Singapore, Tokyo, and New York had been anticipating since the Bandar Abbas tanker seizure 14 days earlier. War risk insurance for Hormuz transit was suspended, not increased, not repriced at a premium that made transit expensive, but operationally viable for vessels with sufficient commercial incentive. Suspended, meaning no policy at any price covering any vessel for any cargo through the Strait of Hormuz effective immediately. No insurance, no transit. It is that simple and that devastating. Vessels without war risk insurance cannot enter the Hormuz transit zone without voiding their hull insurance, their cargo insurance, their crew liability coverage, and the specific protection and indemnity club membership that covers pollution liability in the event of an incident. No reputable shipping company operating within the international maritime regulatory framework can direct a vessel into an uninsured war zone. The legal exposure, the regulatory consequences, and the financial liability of an uninsured incident in the world's most strategically sensitive waterway are not risks that commercial shipping operators can absorb, regardless of how attractive the freight economics appear. The suspension was announced at 8:00 inches the morning, London time. By noon the same day, the vessel traffic management data that the United Kingdom Maritime Trade Operations tracks in real time showed the specific collapse that nobody in the public conversation about the Hormuz crisis had been fully prepared for, despite the fact that every maritime analyst who was paying attention had seen it coming for 3 weeks. 100 ships per day had been transiting the strait at the conflict period's beginning. Tankers, container vessels, bulk carriers, LNG carriers, chemical tankers, the full spectrum of commercial maritime traffic that moves approximately 20% of the world's traded oil, 30% of global LNG, and hundreds of billions of dollars of manufactured goods, raw materials, and agricultural commodities through 21 miles of water between the Omani coast and the Iranian shore every single day. 100 ships per day collapsed to 5 ships per day transiting the Strait of Hormuz, not because the IRGC was physically blocking transit for every vessel, but because the insurance suspension made the 95 vessels that would otherwise have transited commercially inoperable in the Hormuz zone, regardless of what the IRGC was or was not doing on any given day. The IRGC seized 1 tanker. Lloyd's suspended insurance for all tankers. The market did what the market does. When the risk framework collapses, it stops. And the global economy is now absorbing the consequences of 100 ships per day collapsing to 5 in ways that nobody in the public conversation about the Hormuz crisis is discussing with the urgency that the numbers demand. By the end of this video, you are going to understand exactly what the collapse from 100 ships to 5 means for global oil supply, global LNG markets, global container shipping, and the specific economies whose import and export architectures were built around Hormuz transit assumptions that the insurance suspension has made operationally impossible. Why nobody in the public conversation is discussing this with the urgency it deserves, and what that silence reveals about the specific information management that every government with Hormuz exposure is practicing simultaneously. What the 5 ships per day that are still transiting represent, and who is operating them, and under what commercial and legal arrangements. How MBS is using the Hormuz collapse to advance the specific Saudi economic agenda that the oil price weapon against the UAE was only the first phase of. and what the path back to 100 ships per day looks like, and how long that path takes from where the strait is right now. Let us begin with the numbers, because the numbers are the most important thing, and the thing that the public conversation has been most systematically avoiding. 20% of the world's traded oil moves through the Strait of Hormuz every day. This is the number that every energy economist, every oil market analyst, and every government energy security official knows by memory. 20%. Approximately 17 to 18 million barrels per day at the conflict period's pre-crisis transit volumes. Saudi Arabia, the UAE, Kuwait, Iraq, and Iran itself, all of their primary export routes move through the strait. Qatar's LNG exports, which supply approximately 30% of global LNG trade, move through the strait. The petrochemical exports from the Jubail industrial city that MBS has built as the economic foundation of Vision 2030 move through the strait. 20% of the world's traded oil, 100 ships per day. That is what the strait was moving at the conflict period's beginning. 5 ships per day is not 20% of the world's traded oil. 5 ships per day is approximately 1 million barrels per day of crude equivalent, roughly 5 to 6% of what the strait was moving before the insurance suspension. The remaining 14 to 17 million barrels per day that the strait was moving at the conflict period's beginning is not moving. It is sitting in storage tanks at export terminals in Ras Tanura and Ruwais and Basra, accumulating in facilities whose storage capacity was designed for transit rather than storage, filling the specific tank farm infrastructure at a rate that approaches maximum storage capacity within time frames that energy security analysts are calculating with increasing alarm. The oil is not moving, the LNG is not moving, the container goods are not moving, and the global economy, whose supply chains, refinery, contracts, and energy security architectures were built around the assumption that the Hormuz Strait was a functioning transit corridor, is now operating in the specific disruption condition that every energy security scenario planner modeled as the catastrophic case, the case that warranted serious planning precisely because it was assumed to be too economically devastating for any rational actor to allow it to persist. The catastrophic case is here. It has been here for 14 days since the insurance suspension, and the public conversation is discussing it with a fraction of the urgency the numbers demand. The silence is not accidental. It is managed, and understanding who is managing it and why reveals the specific political economy of the Hormuz collapse that the numbers alone cannot communicate. Every government with significant Hormuz exposure, and that means every government in Asia, every government in Europe, and the American government whose strategic petroleum reserve and whose alliance commitments to Asian and European partners are all directly implicated, is managing the public communication about the Hormuz collapse with the specific information discipline that prevents the full scale of the disruption from becoming the dominant public narrative. The reason is straightforward and worth stating directly. When the full scale of the Hormuz collapse becomes the dominant public narrative, when the collapse from 100 ships per day to 5 becomes the lead story in every financial market, every energy market, and every political conversation simultaneously, the specific market behaviors that governments are trying to prevent become inevitable. Panic buying of available crude supplies outside the Hormuz zone, oil price spikes that exceed what the strategic petroleum reserve release architectures of the major consuming nations were designed to offset, LNG spot market price explosions that make European energy security, still recovering from the post-Ukraine Russian supply disruption, immediately fragile again. Shipping freight rate explosions for Cape-routed and Pacific-routed alternative vessels that impose costs on every supply chain whose goods previously moved through Hormuz. All of these market behaviors are rational responses to accurate information about the Hormuz collapse's scale. All of them make the Hormuz collapse's consequences worse, faster than they would develop if the information management holds the market response to a slower and more controlled adjustment process. Governments are managing public communication to slow the market response. This is not a conspiracy. It is the specific crisis communication calculus that every government with significant market exposure makes, when the alternative to information management is the market panic that converts a serious disruption into an unmanageable one. The information management is working imperfectly. Energy market professionals, the specific traders, analysts, and risk managers whose professional function requires them to understand the Hormuz transit data regardless of what public communication suggests, know the numbers. The 100 to 5 collapse is priced into the specific forward curves and freight rate structures and LNG spot premiums that the professional energy market is generating in real time. But the professional market's pricing of the disruption has not yet translated into the public narrative that would trigger the retail panic that governments are managing the information to prevent. The window between professional market pricing and public narrative panic is the specific window that governments are using to develop the policy responses that might narrow the gap between 5 ships per day and something more functional, before the public narrative catches up with the professional market's knowledge. The 5 ships per day that are still transiting are the specific vessels whose operational arrangements are worth understanding because they reveal the specific commercial and political architecture that has survived the insurance suspension. The 5 transiting vessels are not operating under standard commercial insurance. They are operating under one of 3 alternative arrangements that the insurance suspension created the market for. The first arrangement is state guarantee. Vessels whose flag state or cargo owner has provided direct sovereign guarantee of liability coverage in lieu of commercial insurance. Chinese flag vessels carrying Chinese contracted crude from Iranian and Iraqi loading ports have been transiting under the specific Chinese state guarantee framework that the People's Bank of China's marine liability guarantee instrument makes available for strategic commodity imports. The Chinese sovereign guarantee is not a commercial insurance product. It is the specific state financial instrument that China deploys when its strategic import requirements override the commercial insurance market's risk calculus. The second arrangement is mutual war risk clubs. Several of the protection and indemnity clubs that provide marine liability coverage to their membership owners have established specific mutual arrangements for Hormuz transit that pool war risk exposure across their membership rather than placing it with the Lloyd's market that the suspension removed. The mutual arrangements are limited in capacity. They cannot absorb the full 100 ships per day transit volume that the Lloyd's market was covering before the suspension, but they cover the specific subset of vessels whose ship owner membership in the mutual clubs and whose cargo economics justify the premium levels that mutual war risk coverage at current Hormuz risk levels requires. The third arrangement is self-insurance by major state oil companies. Saudi Aramco, ADNOC, and the Kuwait Petroleum Corporation have all activated their self-insurance frameworks for specific vessel categories carrying their own crude on vessels they directly own or have on long-term bareboat charter. Self-insurance by a major state oil company with the balance sheet depth to absorb an incident without commercial insurance support is the specific financial arrangement that the insurance suspension cannot stop because it does not depend on the Lloyd's market whose suspension created the disruption. 5 ships per day, 3 different coverage arrangements, none of them scalable to the 100 ships per day that the Hormuz transit corridor was moving before the Lloyd's suspension. The gap between 5 and 100 is not closable through alternative insurance arrangements in the time frame that the global economy's Hormuz exposure demands. It is only closable through one of 2 mechanisms: a security guarantee architecture that restores the Lloyd's market's confidence in the Hormuz transit risk to the level that allows commercial coverage to resume, or a diplomatic resolution of the specific Iranian maritime threat that produced the Bandar Abbas seizure, whose actuarial consequences the Lloyd's Committee translated into the suspension. Both mechanisms are being pursued simultaneously. Neither is close to completion, and the global economy is absorbing the disruption at a rate whose consequences are compounding every day that the gap between 5 and 100 remains. MBS is using the Hormuz collapse to advance the specific Saudi economic agenda whose first phase was the oil price weapon against the UAE. The Saudi economic agenda in the Hormuz collapse context has 3 dimensions that operate simultaneously and that MBS has been engineering the conditions for, since the Bandar Abbas seizure created the specific market opportunity that the Rexo insurance suspension has expanded into a structural advantage. The first dimension is market share capture. Saudi Arabia's self-insurance framework for Aramco-operated vessels is the specific operational architecture that allows Saudi crude to move through the Strait slowly in limited volumes using the 5 ships per day capacity that the combined self-insurance and state guarantee frameworks provide, while competing producers cannot move their crude at all through the commercial insurance-dependent vessel pool that the Lloyd's suspension has frozen. Saudi crude moving while competing crude cannot move is the specific market share capture mechanism that MBS's pre-crisis preparation made possible. Every refinery in Asia and Europe that has a Saudi Aramco supply contract and whose alternative supply arrangements are Hormuz dependent is now exclusively dependent on Saudi Aramco's specific operational capability to move crude through the insurance gap. Exclusive dependency produces the specific contract negotiation leverage that MBS is using to lock Asian and European refineries into longer-term supply arrangements on Saudi terms at prices and volumes that the pre-crisis competitive market would not have supported. The second dimension is infrastructure, investment, acceleration. The Hormuz collapse has created the specific political urgency that Saudi Arabia's alternative export infrastructure development requires to attract the international investment and engineering commitment that the NEOM and Yanbu export expansion programs need. A global economy watching 100 ships per day collapse to 5 through the Hormuz Strait is a global economy that will fund alternative pipeline, port, and export terminal infrastructure in ways that normal commercial returns calculations would not justify. Saudi Arabia's western coast export infrastructure, the specific Red Sea port and pipeline network that routes crude and petrochemicals to European and American markets without Hormuz transit, is the alternative architecture that MBS has been developing as the long-term hedge against exactly the Hormuz disruption scenario that the current collapse has produced. The collapse converts the infrastructure investment from a strategic hedge into an immediate commercial necessity that the international infrastructure investment community cannot rationally decline to fund. The third dimension is the negotiating leverage. The Hormuz collapse creates, in the Islamabad framework's economic architecture, an Iran whose primary crude export route is disrupted by the insurance suspension that the Bandar Abbas seizure produced. That is an Iran whose fiscal position is deteriorating at a rate that the framework's economic transformation offer is the specific instrument to reverse. Saudi Arabia's self-insurance capability allows Saudi crude to move, while Iranian crude cannot move through the same insurance-suspended strait. The economic asymmetry, Saudi Arabia can export, Iran cannot, is the specific fiscal pressure that makes the Islamabad framework's economic reintegration offer more valuable to Iranian decision-makers than at any previous point in the negotiation. MBS engineered the conditions. Iran provided the triggering event. The Lloyd's Committee provided the market mechanism. And the Hormuz collapse is now producing the specific combination of Saudi market share capture, infrastructure investment acceleration, and Iranian fiscal pressure that MBS's strategic agenda required. The global economic consequences of the 100-5 collapse are developing along specific pathways whose speed and severity are the product of the specific supply chain and energy security architectures that different regions built around Hormuz transit assumptions. Asia is the most immediately exposed. South Korea, Japan, and Taiwan, whose refinery import architectures are between 60 and 80% Hormuz dependent for crude supply, are activating strategic petroleum reserve release protocols that were designed for 30-day disruption events rather than open-ended insurance suspension scenarios. The strategic reserves of all three countries provide between 60 and 90 days of import cover at normal refinery run rates. Reducing refinery run rates extends the strategic reserve cover, but imposes the specific downstream disruption of reduced petroleum product availability that automotive fuel supply, petrochemical feedstock supply, and power generation fuel supply chains translate into economic costs across every sector of the affected economies. China's position is structurally different from the other Asian importers because China's state guarantee framework keeps Chinese contracted vessels moving through the strait at a limited rate. But the specific Chinese contracted volumes moving under state guarantee are insufficient to supply China's full crude import requirement. The gap between Chinese state-guaranteed Hormuz transit capacity and China's total import is being filled through accelerated purchases from Russian and West African producers whose supply routes do not involve Hormuz transit. The Russian supply acceleration to fill China's Hormuz gap is the specific energy market development that benefits Russia's fiscal position in the conflict period in ways that Russian strategic coordination with the IRGC confrontation factions agenda had calculated as an anticipated benefit of Hormuz disruption escalation. This is the specific alignment between Russian strategic interests and IRGC confrontation faction operational agenda that MBS's intelligence assessment identified as the external pressure driving the confrontation factions' escalation beyond what its organic institutional weight inside Iranian governance would produce. Europe's exposure is concentrated in the LNG dimension rather than the crude dimension. European crude imports from the Gulf move predominantly through the Suez Canal rather than directly through Hormuz, creating a routing buffer that moderates the immediate crude supply impact. But European LNG imports from Qatar, which provide approximately 25% of European LNG supply, are fully Hormuz dependent. Qatar's LNG export terminals are inside the Gulf. The LNG carriers that move Qatari LNG to European regasification terminals must transit Hormuz. The insurance suspension covers LNG carriers identically to crude tankers. European LNG spot prices are reflecting this exposure in the forward curve that the professional energy market has been pricing since the suspension. The specific European natural gas storage levels that determine European energy security heading into the following winter are drawing down faster than seasonal norms because the anticipated Qatari LNG replenishment that European utilities had contracted for is not arriving through the insurance-suspended Strait. Pakistan's response to the Hormuz collapse is the dimension that connects the maritime disruption most directly to the Islamabad framework's trajectory. Pakistan's own energy security is significantly Hormuz-dependent. Pakistani crude imports and LNG imports both route through the Strait. The Hormuz collapse's energy supply impact on Pakistan's domestic economy is creating the specific domestic political pressure on the Pakistani government that complicates Pakistani mediation's neutrality posture. The specific appearance of equidistance between Iranian and American Saudi positions that Pakistani mediation's credibility requires. A Pakistan whose domestic economy is being damaged by the Iranian maritime behavior that produced the insurance suspension cannot maintain unlimited equidistance between Iranian and American Saudi positions on the framework's resolution timeline without the domestic political consequences of the energy crisis undermining the government's capacity to maintain the mediation investment. The Pakistani Prime Minister has communicated this specific pressure to Iranian leadership through the back channel with a directness that previous Pakistani communications to Tehran have not used. The message is not a threat. It is a statement of political reality. Pakistani mediation can continue to bridge the Iranian-American-Saudi gap in the Islamabad framework's remaining provisions. But Pakistani mediation's domestic political sustainability, the specific government survival calculation that every democracy's foreign policy is ultimately bound by, requires the Hormuz situation to begin moving toward resolution within a time frame that the Pakistani domestic energy crisis can absorb. The Pakistani domestic energy crisis is the specific new pressure vector on Iranian decision-making that the Hormuz collapse has produced and that the public conversation is not discussing because the connection between Pakistani energy imports and Pakistani mediation, political sustainability, is too indirect for the standard analysis frameworks to capture. But it is the most important indirect consequence of the 1-0-0-5 collapse for the Islamabad framework's timeline, because Pakistan's mediation is the framework's operational backbone, and the operational backbone's political sustainability is now time-limited by the specific domestic energy crisis that Iran's Bandar Abbas seizure triggered through the Lloyd's suspension that the seizure produced. The path from 5 ships per day back to 100 ships per day runs through one of 2 corridors, and both corridors run through the Islamabad framework rather than around it. The first corridor is the security guarantee architecture, the specific multilateral naval presence and rules of engagement framework that restores Lloyd's market confidence in Hormuz transit risk to the level that commercial coverage can resume. Building this architecture requires a level of multilateral coordination between the American-led maritime coalition, the Gulf states, and the specific legal frameworks that govern naval engagement in internationally recognized waterways that takes months to develop in normal diplomatic conditions and longer in the active conflict conditions that the current Hormuz crisis represents. The second corridor is the diplomatic resolution of Iranian maritime threat through the framework's regional security guarantee provisions, the specific commitments on Iranian maritime behavior in the Hormuz zone that the framework's architecture includes as a component of the broader regional security guarantee structure Iran needs alongside nuclear oversight. Iranian commitment to maritime behavioral constraints within the framework's Hormuz provisions is the specific instrument that removes the threat that produced the insurance suspension and restores the Lloyd's market's ability to price Hormuz transit risk at commercial levels. The second corridor is faster than the first. Not fast. The Iranian commitment to maritime behavioral constraints requires the framework's completion on the nuclear oversight and regional security guarantee provisions, whose negotiation has been the central challenge of the Islamabad process throughout its duration, but faster than the multilateral naval architecture, whose construction timeline exceeds any commercially viable disruption duration. 100 ships per day collapsed to 5. The global economy is absorbing the consequences at a compounding rate. Strategic reserves are drawing down. Asian refineries are cutting run rates. European LNG storage is depleting faster than seasonal norms. Russian LNG is filling Chinese supply gaps and funding Moscow's strategic coordination with the IRGC confrontation faction. Pakistan's domestic energy crisis is time-limiting the mediation's political sustainability. And the Islamabad framework, whose completion is the specific instrument that reopens the second corridor back to 100 ships per day, is the thing that nobody in the public conversation is connecting to the maritime collapse. They are also not discussing with the urgency the numbers demand. The Lloyd's Committee met at 6:00 the morning. The suspension was announced at 8. By noon, the collapse was visible in the vessel traffic data, and the world's most important waterway went from 100 ships per day to 5 without the public conversation connecting the maritime devastation to the diplomatic resolution that is the only instrument fast enough to reverse it, before the compounding consequences exceed the absorption capacity of every strategic reserve, every alternative supply arrangement, and every government's information management discipline. Something devastating happened in Hormuz. It has been happening for 14 days. The numbers are 100 to 5, and the path back runs through the framework that nobody is publicly connecting to the collapse that everyone is privately calculating the cost of. 5 ships per day. The world is paying for every one of the 95 that are not moving, every day, compounding in silence.